Greetings, truth seekers. Welcome back. It is a privilege to have you. Join me again as we pull back the veil on history. Today, we are setting the coordinates of our inquiry to the mid-19th century. This was an era of rapid industrialization, a time when the world was allegedly rushing headlong into modernity. But for those of us who look closer, it was also a time of profound anomalies. We are turning our gaze toward a specific stretch of land that has found itself at the center of human conflict time and time again. We know it today as the Crimean Peninsula in the maps of the ancients, and perhaps in the whispered legends of the old world. This territory was the gateway to the vast expanse known as Grand Tartary. The history books tell us that between October 1853 and February 1856, this peninsula was the stage for the Crimean War. It is a conflict that modern historians often cite as the birth of modern warfare, introducing railways, the telegraph, and explosive naval shells. But perhaps most importantly for our investigation, it was the first major conflict to be extensively documented by the camera. And this is where the narrative begins to fracture. When we examine the official timeline, we are told that the Russian Empire was locked in a bitter struggle against an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, France, Britain, and Sardinia. We are told of glorious charges, of bustling supply lines, and of a strategically vital region teeming with infrastructure. But does the photographic evidence support the story? I have spent some time curating a collection of high-resolution images from this period, specifically dated between 1853 and 1856. While you may have seen grainy versions of these photos before, looking at them in high definition reveals a reality that is starkly different from the paintings and written accounts of the time. The first thing that strikes the observer is the silence of the landscape as we scroll through these images, which are technically the first war photographs in existence. Ask yourself what is missing. If this was a vital region of the Russian Empire, a hub of trade and a strategic military stronghold, where is the life? We are looking at wide-angle shots of vast valleys and rolling hills, yet the terrain is almost completely barren. There are no forests. There are hardly any bushes. In fact, in many of these frames, one cannot find a single tree. How does an army of hundreds of thousands sustain itself in a landscape that resembles the surface of the moon more than a fertile European peninsula? We are told that this region was key to controlling the Black Sea, yet the ground appears to have been stripped bare, as if subjected to some great environmental upheaval prior to the arrival of the troops. Furthermore, we must address the architecture, or rather the lack of it. The narrative insists that Russia had fortified this post with massive citadels and port cities that had stood for centuries. Yet, when the camera lenses of the 1850s captured the scene, where are these cities? We see no bustling towns. We see no civilian infrastructure. We see no roads lined with homes. Instead, we see a desolate wasteland. The only structures visible are often tent cities or makeshift shacks that look as though they were hastily erected by the arriving soldiers. It begs the question, were these armies truly fighting over a strategic port, or were they occupying a ruin? If there were massive fortifications here, they seem to be suspiciously absent from the background. The land looks scoured. It looks empty. It brings to mind the theories of a tabula rasa, a blank slate event with a previous civilization, perhaps the one we call Tartaria, had already been wiped away before the first British or French soldier ever set foot on the shore. Consider the logistics. We are told that the port of Sevastopol was a bustling naval base. Yet in the photographs of the harbor, where is the fleet? Where are the merchant ships? Where are the docks and the warehouses? That would be required to support a 19th century naval superpower. The images show a stillness that is almost haunting. It does not look like a war zone. In the traditional sense, it looks like an archaeological site. Is it possible that the conflict we call the Korean War was not a war of conquest, but an operation of containment? Could it be that these superpowers united, not to fight Russia, but to secure, excavate, and perhaps destroy the remnants of a civilization that had recently fallen? As we look at these barren hills, void of trees and life, we have to wonder if we are seeing the aftermath of a war, or the aftermath of a cataclysm that the war was designed to cover up. How let us shift our focus from the empty, barren earth to the people who were sent to occupy it. If the landscape suggests a desolate aftermath, the figures standing within it present a riddle entirely their own. When we examine the official narrative of the Crimean War, we are told it was a grueling, muddy, and bloody affair. We are told of disease, of supply shortages, and of long march through hostile terrain. Logic dictates that soldiers living in tents on a dirt plain for months on end would look rugged, weathered, and filthy. Yet look closely at the men in these photographs. What do we see? We see officers and infantrymen dressed in immaculate uniforms. Their jackets are pressed. Their buttons shine, but most impossibly. Look at their footwear and image after image. We see men standing on loose dirt and dry earth, yet their boots are polished to a mirror sheen. There is no mud, there is no dust. How is this logistically possible? If these men had marched for days to reach these positions, or if they had been fighting in the trenches, their attire should reflect the grit of war. Instead, they look as though they have just stepped out of a dressing room in London or Paris. It creates a sense of dissonance, almost as if we are looking at actors in a costume drama rather than soldiers in a kill zone. Critics will often argue that early photography required long exposure times, meaning subjects had to pose still for minutes, which explains the lack of action shots. While this is true technically, it does not explain the pristine condition of their clothing. It does not explain why the atmosphere feels less like a desperate siege and more like a leisurely expedition. There is a distinct picnic quality to many of these scenes. We see officers lounging with wine bottles, sitting on imported furniture. That seems completely out of place in a barren wasteland. It raises a controversial possibility. Were these armies actually fighting a high-intensity war? Or were they simply an occupying force, sent to curate a narrative? Then there is the matter of the people themselves. The diversity of faces and phenotypes in these albums is staggering. We see men of all statures and backgrounds mingled together, but one specific anomaly stands out above the rest. Quite literally, buried within the archives of this campaign, there is a recurring figure who defies the proportions of everyone around him. In the captions of the original photographs, he is identified as the postmaster of the Crimea, a man named Mr. Angel. The name itself feels almost too poetic, perhaps a code or a nod to an older heritage. But it is his physical presence that stops you in your tracks. In a world where the makeshift soldier huts have doorways that appear to be roughly 2 feet high, Mr. Angel towers over the architecture. In the photographs where he appears, he is significantly taller than his counterparts, while the other soldiers seem to fit the scale of the temporary wooden shacks. Mr. Angel looks like a giant among men. He does not seem to fit the environment. When we look at the doorways of the camps, they are tiny, they are cramped. They seem built for a smaller population. Or perhaps they were hastily constructed by men who had lost the knowledge of grand architecture. Yet standing next to them is this man, Mr. Angel, who looks like a remnant of a different time. Why is the postmaster a logistical role singled out in these war albums? And why does he carry himself with an air that is so distinct from the military officers? Some researchers of the alternative timeline have suggested that figures like this might be survivors of the previous civilization, the Grand Tartary that was being erased. Was he a captive, a collaborator, or simply a local inhabitant of superior stature who was being documented by the invaders? This brings us to the structures themselves. Throughout the background of these soldier portraits, we see the camp buildings. They are primitive, they are rough, they are essentially shacks, made of scrap wood and stone. This is the best the great powers of the 19th century could build. Compare these rough hovels to the magnificent stone architecture we see in the cities of St. Petersburg or Paris from the same era. The disconnect is jarring. It reinforces the theory that the armies we see were not the builders of the old world. They were merely the inheritors living in the ruins. They appeared to be squatting on the land, unable to replicate the grandeur that perhaps existed there before the cataclysm. As we stare at the polished boots of the officers and the towering frame of Mr. Angel, the official story of a standard geopolitical war begins to feel thin. We are left with the uneasy feeling that this was not a battle for territory, but a staged event designed to finalize the transition from the old world to the new. As we reach the final chapter of this investigation, we must look at the physical activities captured in these photographs. If the landscape was barren and the soldiers were strangely pristine, what exactly were they doing there for nearly 3 years? When we zoom in on the panoramic views of Balaclava and the surrounding valleys, the activity on the ground often resembles a massive industrial operation rather than a battlefield. In numerous images, we see strange, perfect circles carved into the earth. We see mounds of soil piled high, forming ring-like structures that do not seem to serve a defensive purpose against cannon fire. Instead, they look like the spoiled tips of an excavation. The narrative tells us these men were digging trenches, and siege works, but look at the scale. Look at the precision, and most importantly, look at what they were uncovering. There are photographs in this collection that show what is described as a fortress, yet the structure appears to be almost entirely subterranean. We see soldiers posing at the entrances of stone arches that lead deep underground, as if the building had been buried by a massive influx of soil, perhaps the result of a liquefaction event or a cataclysm that occurred prior to their arrival. Were these armies digging in to fight the Russians, or were they digging down to access the buried infrastructure of the Tartarian world? This theory of war as excavation gains weight when we consider the geopolitical oddities of the conflict. The Crimean War saw a bizarre alliance where the British and French empires joined forces with their historical rival, the Ottoman Empire, to fight against Russia. Historians tell us this was a dispute over religious rights in the Holy Land and a check on Russian expansion. But does it make sense that the great Christian powers of Western Europe would align so readily with the Ottomans against a fellow Christian empire, mobilizing such a massive force to fight over a barren, empty peninsula? Unless, of course, the objective was not political, but existential. If the region known as Grand Tartary had recently fallen, leaving behind advanced technology, star forts and architectural wonders buried in the mud, it would be the ultimate prize. The Allies may have descended upon Crimea, not to save the Ottoman Empire, but to secure the site, loot the remnants, and ensure that the history of the previous civilization was thoroughly erased. Consider the siege of Sevastopol. We are told it lasted 11 months. For nearly a year, the combined might of the world's most powerful militaries pounded this location. The result was absolute devastation. The ancient port city was leveled. The fortifications were pulverized. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1856, what had actually changed? The borders barely moved. The geopolitical balance shifted only slightly. But the physical history of the region had been wiped off the face of the earth. The ancient castles were gone. The infrastructure was rubble. It is the perfect crime. If you want to erase a civilization, you do not just knock it down. You stage a war on top of it. You use the fog of war as a cover story for the demolition of the old world. We are told the Crimean War was the first modern war. It introduced us to the railway in combat, the telegraph, and the explosive shell. But perhaps it was also the first sop of the modern era, of the first time photography was used not to document the truth, but to sell a fabricated reality to the public back home. Look at the images one last time. We see a world that is empty, devoid of trees, devoid of the bustle of organic life. We see soldiers who look like tourists in a wasteland. We see a Mr. Angel who stands like a giant among men. And we see the systematic excavation of a buried past. Was the mid-19th century a time of progress? Or was it a recovery operation following a global reset? The history books give us dates and treaties, but the photographs give us questions. They show us a silence that screams for an explanation. As we close this file on the Crimean anomalies, I leave the conclusion to you. Do these images show the birth of modern warfare, or do they show the funeral of a lost empire? The truth, as always, is buried just beneath the surface. Thank you for watching. Keep questioning the narrative.